Genevieve Gore, the matriarch behind the vast Gortex fortune, dies at the age of 91, leaving behind 5 children, 19 grandchildren, and a company worth billions. Some think more of those billions should go to them.
Some people are able to handle wealth better than others. For some, it corrupts how they think about themselves.
And a nasty legal battle brews over questions of entitlement and the birthright of wealth.
He wanted to be the Paris Hilton of Delaware. I think it's just that simple.
As conflict, treachery, and greed erupt in the family she leaves behind.
They planned this like somebody was almost planning a bank heist.
January 20th, 2005, Genevieve Gore dies at the age of 91. Years earlier, she and her husband Wilbert, known to friends as Vive and Bill, founded a company currently worth billions.
They're incredibly well known in Delaware, but they're also really not big publicity hounds. They're kind of keep to themselves. The children of the Gores still are involved in the company. They still come in and work.
They were considered a dignified, rich family in this community, but not really well known.
Vive's 5 children and 19 grandchildren gather to mourn the woman who bound together their close-knit family. The history of the family and of the company they built is tightly intertwined.
Bill Gore was raised out west, and he came to Wilmington to work for the DuPont Company as an engineer, chemist.
In Newark, Delaware, Vive and Bill raised their 5 children: Bob, Susan, Ginger, David, and Betty.
The Gores were extremely family-centric. I mean, they were known for spending time with their children. They were known for being involved in their children's life. They really stressed values.
One value in particular received special emphasis.
Bill Gore really stressed the work ethic in his family.
They came from a middle-class family in Delaware, and there was a strong work ethic, a strong belief in putting in 9 to 5, a strong belief in commitment.
In 1957, Bill leaves DuPont, taking his work ethic with him, and starts his own company with Vive.
He decided to branch out on his own, and he formed this Gore company, Wilbur L. Gore and Associates.
The company was started in the basement after Bill left DuPont. I'm sure money was tight, so like many entrepreneurs, they either start in the basement or they start in the garage.
1959. The children are growing. Robert, the oldest, is in college. And as Bill and Vive's new company takes its first steps, their eldest daughter, Susan, celebrates her wedding to a young man named Jan Otto.
Jan was not somebody that the Gores, I believe, would have picked for their daughter, Susan. He came from a background that was not similar to hers. He was not wealthy by any means.
Both went to public high school in Delaware, and both went off to college in Vermont.
Just over 10 years later, in 1969, Robert, the oldest son who now works for the family company, makes a discovery that will change everything for the Gores. He finds a way to stretch Teflon into a cable so thin that it can be woven into fabric. The new fabric is called Gortex. It revolutionizes the clothing industry.
Eventually, they found that the product could be used for clothing. Gortex is the brand that's best known among Gore's products, and chances are almost everyone in America has something that's made out of Gortex.
Gortex made them probably richer beyond their wildest imagination. It just created this vast wealth for them and their families.
They became millionaires almost overnight.
Today, the Gore company is $3.5 billion. It's all based on, almost all of their products are in this stretched plastic from the 1960s.
The wealth doesn't change the Gore family or their values.
Despite their success, they did not act like millionaires. They did not flaunt their wealth. I mean, they stayed in Newark, which is nice, but it's not Manhattan, it's not LA.
And slowly, steadily built this company up, and they were very low key. They were never in any scandal One of his sons ended up taking over the company. So they had a very nice reputation. They were philanthropists, but very quietly about it. Their house is like out in the country. You couldn't even see it from the road, but it was not some elaborate mansion.
But with Viv's death, the fabric that holds this close-knit family together begins to unravel, even as they gather to mourn.
They were united in a moment of silence, in a moment of respect for Genevieve at the funeral. There was a moment where they did come together as one, as a family, to mourn Genevieve, but quickly after that, it started to deteriorate.
And it all has to do with the family trust. After Robert's discovery of Gortex in 1969, Bill and Viv realize they have a problem.
As Gortex grew and Gortex became a bigger corporation, he was becoming more concerned, Bill Gore was becoming more concerned about leaving money for his children. Gore was an incredibly smart man. He had the vision. He had the foresight to see where his company was headed. And he knew that down the line, as the percentage increases, the percentage of the IRS's take is going to increase as well. So they went to their attorney in Delaware and they asked him to help construct a will that they could avoid taxes. It was very, very important to Bill and Genevieve that this remain a family company.
To keep it all in the family, Bill and Viv create two family trusts. The first trust bequeaths company shares to their children. The second, the Pokeberry Trust, will go to the grandchildren.
The Pokeberry Trust was established by Bill and Genevieve Gore in hopes of making sure that their grandchildren all inherited an equal amount of money. Now, it was done in a way in which some of the shares from the company would come from their parents and some would come from the Pokeberry Trust. If you had more children, then your children would get a larger share.
So they created the Pokeberry Trust to take care of their grandchildren with money on top of what their own parents were going to give them.
By the time they create the trust, the Gore family has grown up and out.
Each of those 5 children produced 4 grandchildren, except for Susan. She had 3. They were all raised with the same work ethic and the same commitment to their company and the same values that the Gores grew up with.
All 5 children join the Gore Board of Directors, and Robert replaces his father as CEO.
The Gores worked very hard to instill that sense of work ethic and that sense of commitment and, let's not flaunt our wealth, let's not be extravagant into their children. And their children, except for Susan, took that to heart.
She was sort of a free spirit, that's how I would characterize her.
And just days after the funeral, the family's free spirit reveals an astonishing secret that will shake the family to the core.
Nobody had any clue. Even at the funeral, nobody had any clue.
In 2005, Viv Gore, co-founder of the company that invented Gortex, dies. She leaves behind a loving and close-knit family and a trust to ensure that the company remains in family hands. It all seems very straightforward, but the family is in for a big surprise. About a month after the funeral, Susan Gore phones her siblings one by one to make an astonishing announcement. Back in 2003, at the age of 64, without telling anyone else, she legally adopts a son. And this up-to-now secret son stands in line to inherit the Gortex millions, along with the other 19 grandchildren.
Nobody could anticipate the craziness that would happen with the announcement that Susan had adopted. There was a lot of fighting. Basically, the other Gore children accused her of doing this to seek money, basically hurled insults at her, saying she was, doing this solely for money, that called her greedy. She was definitely the rebel in the family. She was not somebody who was active in the company the way the brothers and sisters were. She definitely was different from the other Gore children. She just marched to the beat of a different drum.
Susan did not tell her brothers and sisters that she had done this. She did not tell her mother. There was no public record of this, so there was no reason for anyone else in the family to know about it. And Susan said, I now have 4 children. Treat them the way that all the other grandchildren are being treated.
Her siblings are blindsided, not just by the fact that Susan is secretly adopted, but by who she is adopted. This is just the latest move in the fight for Viv's money, the final stage of a plot that has been unfolding for years.
Otto's sons, Nathan, Jan, and Joel, all lived pretty well. They were all wealthy. Wealthier than most of us will ever be.
Even after divorcing her husband Jan in 1981, Susan and her family spent their money differently than the rest of the Gores.
Bill and Viv Gore wanted to take care of the future generations of the family, and their philosophy was that it wouldn't be a consumptive kind of family. They would pass on their money through the generations, for hundreds of years.
But Susan's youngest son, Nathan, doesn't want to live as modestly as his grandparents did.
You have one of the grandsons, Nate, saying, why should we be like that? We don't need to be 9 to 5. We're wealthy, we're millionaires. We should be enjoying it. He wanted to be the Paris Hilton of Delaware. I think it's just that simple. He wanted to be the limelight. He wanted to be extravagant. He wanted to not have to work. He wanted to be out there showing how wealthy he was, that he was a member of the Gore family and enjoying all the benefits he believed came with being a member of the Gore family.
So in 2001, 36-year-old Nathan sends a proposal to the family.
Nate sends out a memo to his aunts and uncles and cousins, which is entitled From Nouveau Riche to Sustainable Wealth. And in it, he says that that a major wealthy family is living a middle-class lifestyle, and they're losing the opportunity to benefit themselves in the world. And that's very shocking for a member of the Gore family to say something like that.
Nathan argues that keeping their fortune in Gore stock instead of diversifying limits their potential financial growth. He also says they could do more for themselves and the world by living the life they were born into, the life of the wealthy.
He felt he was entitled to the money. In the memo he sent out, he talks in there about how the world would benefit from himself and his grandchildren living the lifestyle that comes with being born into wealth.
But the Gore siblings reject Nathan's proposals.
It was well-reasoned, they weren't going to buy it. They thought of it as the family would be the stewards of this fortune. They would pass it down maybe for 3 centuries. And that as a steward, your role is not to spend it lavishly, and it's not to spend it irresponsibly.
Nathan's frustration grows when 1 year later he discovers that he and his brothers will receive a smaller share of the Pokeberry Trust than his cousins. Bill and Viv assume that Susan's children will inherit more from her, since she has fewer kids to split her shares between, and since the other grandkids will inherit less from their parents. They tried to make up for that by giving the other kids equal shares through the Pokeberry Trust, and that is what upsets Nathan.
It was reported, although not verified, that a share in the trust was worth $66,000. Now, because of the way the trust was structured in the will, his cousins would receive 420 shares. So that's roughly $27 million. Him and his brothers were receiving 95 shares, which is roughly $6 million. And I know it's hard to feel sorry for somebody who's getting $6 million, but when you compare that his cousins are getting $27 million for something that nobody has any control of, I can certainly understand his frustration.
But it's not like they're on the street. I mean, you've got these businesses and they're living better than you and I.
There is nothing the Ottos can do to increase their share, not as long as Susan has one less child than her siblings.
Nathan came up with the idea, the adoption, by having a 4th child under the exact terms of the trust that would give each of the Otto children, natural and adopted, a greater share of this trust.
But no one could imagine where the adoption search will lead them.
Who would ever think you would write a line that said, Susan Gore was 64, her new son was 65.
After the death of billionaire Viv Gore, her daughter Susan shocks her siblings when she reveals that she has secretly adopted a 4th son to give her other children a bigger slice of the inheritance. But the identity of her new son is an even bigger shock to the Gores. After rejecting several adoption candidates, Susan is running out of options. Her ex-husband Jan suggests a very surprising candidate, himself.
They were joking, and he did say, well, if we can't find anybody to adopt, you might as well adopt me. And everybody laughed, but then they started thinking, hey, wait a second, they may be onto something here. And eventually they thought about it, and they realized that he probably is the best candidate for them to adopt, and that's when they decided to move forward.
Jan points out to Susan that he is the best choice because, after all, as he says, he has the best interests of all involved parties at heart. Convinced, Susan decides to adopt her ex-husband. She asks him to come to Wyoming, where she now lives and where adult adoption is legal.
The exact arrangement between Jan and Susan was that they would go to Wyoming. She would adopt him solely for the purposes of circumventing the Gore's trust. They would not tell anybody about the adoption until after Genevieve's passing, in which case they would make the announcement, because that would substantially increase the amount of money that her sons would receive. It was kept secret, and Jan did not want anything from Susan. His only concern at that time was he did not want to incur any personal expenses or any debt doing this.
Amazingly, the courts in Wyoming allowed this.
Adoption, 98-point-something% of the time, maybe higher, is done, for reasons of wanting to give someone a home who doesn't have one. Give a child a home who doesn't have one, and sometimes an older person, a youth or an adult even. But it isn't very frequently, to the best of my knowledge, and I know a little about this, it is rare for it to be used as a means of extracting money from someone. The fact is that in every adoption, a judge, someone says, yes, this is okay, this can proceed. That means in this case, in the Gore case, a judge, someone said, oh, it's okay, this woman can adopt her ex-husband.
After Genevieve's death in 2005, she announced, by the way, 2 years ago, I happened to adopt my ex-husband, who's 3 years older than me.
When I first heard that Susan had adopted her ex, I laughed because it just struck me as crazy. And that the business community probably looked at it the same way. Oh, that's just sort of a crazy family issue. It has to do with the trust. It has to do with the inheritance. People do wild things. They fight when they've never fought before.
And that unleashed what I called a tsunami of protest from the other branches of the family.
From Susan and her family's point of view, the adoption simply makes things fair for everyone.
They made the argument that, the adoption was legal. It was legally recognized in Wyoming. It should be transferred under Delaware law, and for all legal purposes, Jan should be considered a grandchild of the Gores.
After all, the Pokeberry Trust includes adopted children. But the other grandchildren don't buy it.
The cousins immediately objected, and that just started a long, long court battle. They filed court papers immediately and called Jan Otto a sham beneficiary and accused him of double crossing, and it unleashed this gigantic, what I call the Gore War.
I believe it was 2005 they entered mediation. And that mediation dragged on, but Susan would not back down from what she wanted, which was an equal share for her children.
The two sides of the family are now bitterly divided.
They must have been delusional to think that this would be accepted by the rest of the family. But when you're scheming in these ways to try to work around the constraints of the will, of the trust, you're not being rational. The ends come before the means. At this point, you don't care about the rest of the family. Your goal is to put more money in your pocket.
Attempts to reach a settlement drag on.
The Gores made an effort to settle this out of court because the last thing they wanted was their dirty laundry being aired in court documents, so something Bill and Genevieve have avoided all their life. And they were afraid family secrets would get out.
According to the court record, they almost came to an agreement. They were almost there a few times.
They tried a couple of things to resolve it, but under none of those circumstances would Susan's children still receive an equal share. And that was the goal of the adoption, and Susan wouldn't hear of it. She wanted her children to receive an equal amount of share as their cousins, and that was the only thing she would accept.
Then, out of left field comes news that will make this fight even more complicated. The newest Gore grandchild, and also the oldest, has had a change of heart.
When he originally agreed to be adopted by Susan, he went to Susan and said, well, I'm willing to do this as a protest of how the trust is structured and to look out for our children because I don't think it's fair for what's happening to our children.
Jan has assured Susan that he would divide his share of the inheritance between their 3 sons, keeping nothing for himself. But as the dispute drags on, he drops a bombshell.
He changed his mind and said he wanted money. He wanted to get what he was entitled to with the trust. He was now legally a grandchild of the Gores, and he wanted what he was entitled to as a grandchild of the Gores.
And he had reneged on his word that he wasn't going to get anything.
Jan wants his share of the Gore millions. He claims that he and Susan never signed an agreement about the adoption, and so he has a right to the money.
Susan went ballistic over that. She believed that they had this arrangement. She believed that he was doing this solely to look out for the best interest of their children, and now it turns out he's looking out for his own interest.
Susan's plan to win her sons a bigger piece of the Pokeberry pie erupts into a 3-way legal war.
The plan went wrong in 12 different ways.
Susan was furious. Nathan was furious. They were a cohesive unit fighting against everybody else for what they believed was the fair share of their children. Now you have they're fighting, and it starts to break down in their camp because they're all fighting amongst each other.
This battle, pitted cousin against cousin, brother against sister, and pretty much everybody against Jan Otto.
With both the Ottos and the Gores outraged at this new turn of events, the mediation collapses.
They just went at it, and each side dug in and went all the way to trial.
The Gores and the Ottos now face a judge who determines that the dispute will be divided into 2 trials.
He decided to break it up because the first issue that had to be decided was whether Jan Otto could get any share of this money.
The second issue is whether the adoption is valid, thus giving Susan's children a bigger inheritance. This is for the second trial to determine. In March 2010, 5 years after Viv's death, the judge considers the first question: is Jan entitled to keep his share of the trust for himself? Susan argues in court that Jan's claim to the trust is a betrayal of their agreement. It is not the first time he has betrayed her and her sons, nor turned to Susan for money. Though Jan was highly educated, a National Merit Scholar with an undergraduate degree from Cornell, a master's in physics from Dartmouth, and a business degree from Harvard, for some reason he never got a job in those fields. During his marriage to Susan, he did some teaching and worked at a sawmill.
Susan definitely was the breadwinner in that family, and he did not have the money to help support the children.
In the final years of their 22-year marriage, Jan had been seeing another woman.
At some point, he left her, and there was an allegation in the lawsuit that he left her with a note on her windshield, on a windshield of his truck, and took off. His lawyers denied that, and it was never proven one way or the other, but that was the allegation in the lawsuit, that he just split and stopped having contact with the sons and his ex-wife for years and years.
The divorce was extremely bitter, and it was extremely expensive.
Susan and Jan communicate very little after the divorce. Then, out of the blue, nearly 20 years later, Susan contacts him about her difficulties with the Pokeberry Trust.
I don't know why Susan thought she could trust him to adopt, especially based on the rocky relationship they had after their marriage. I have to believe that the only reason she picked him was they were out of options.
Whatever her reason, Susan accepts his offer and the adoption goes forward.
Susan went off and did this, and that kind of fits her character a little bit. She has her own ideas, she has her own perspective on things. It's very different from her brothers and sisters, and this is just another example.
But Susan makes one critical mistake. They never sign an agreement.
They never signed that because it could have jeopardized the actual technical adoption in Wyoming.
And so, in 2010, Jan files a claim that he never waived his right to the Pokeberry Trust. And at trial, his true motive is discovered when his diary is presented as evidence.
Somehow the attorneys got a hold of it through discovery.
And according to his diary notes, Jan had a change of heart a mere 11 days after the adoption. He was thinking about double-crossing his ex-wife and new mom all along.
Around that point, he started writing in his journal of how he had sort of a flash of cupidity, where, maybe I could take some of the dividends, or maybe I could have some of the trust money. And that sort of took root in his journals and in his mind.
The scales are tipped in 2004 when Jan is working at his son's ranch.
He had a dispute with his son Jan's daughter, and over a horse, a sale of a horse or something, and some working conditions, and he got fired. His son fired him.
After his son threatens to withhold his severance, Jan writes in his diary that he can no longer trust his sons to take care of him.
And at that point, he decided that he was going to try to get some of this money. And his lawyers fought for it.
The Gore's lawyer attacks Jan's character.
And the lawyer just decided that he had acted with quote-unquote unclean hands by making all these pledges and assurances and promises and then reneging on them.
The notes that Jan made in his diary played into that, because that was most of the evidence needed to prove that he did this strictly for the money. He had no other goal, there was no other aspiration behind this other than to get the money that he felt he would be entitled to as a grandchild of the Gores. He just came across as sleazy.
The diary entries and the letters and emails he sent to Susan and Nathan stack up against Jan, and after reviewing them, the judge reaches his decision.
The judge just termed his behavior quote-unquote deplorable and ruled that he could not have a single penny from this trust.
It's settled. Jan will not collect a cent. The first battle has been waged and won. Now the second trial will determine what, if anything, the adoption means for Susan's son's inheritance. And soon the real motive for Susan's lawsuit is revealed.
She had 3,900 shares of stock. It had to be worth well over $100 million. What happened to all that money?
5 years after the death of Vive Gore, her family is in court to determine whether daughter Susan's adopted son, her ex-husband Jan, will be recognized as an official grandchild, assuring her other real sons a bigger piece of the trust.
And in the second trial, it turned to, why would Susan and her branch be entitled to this amount of money?
As it turns out, there's a reason that Susan is so determined to increase her son's inheritance. She's trying to make up for her own mistakes.
The Pokeberry Trust assumed that every single one of the 5 children would be responsible enough to set aside shares of stock that they were expected to pass down to their own children.
They were expected to get more from their parents because there were less in that family.
But Susan's family has been asking her for money for years.
She said she invested millions in her son Jan's airplane business. She'd bequeathed so many of her own shares to her children. And what they did with them, only they know. But she went through a lot of money. She was sitting on a Powerball ticket, and somehow it evaporated.
In court, it comes out that not only had Susan given her sons money, she had even hired Nathan as her financial advisor. His first suggestion as her advisor? That she liquidate her remaining Gore shares and give them to him and his brothers.
Nate's financial situation at the time was not solid because most of the other children were involved in the company. He was not as involved in the company. He was not drawing a paycheck from Gore.
When Susan is reluctant to sell, only then does he discover and propose addressing the Pokeberry Trust problem.
Susan did not have the money to leave him, and he was still going to get $6 million, but why, settle for 6 when you can get 27?
Susan had tried to address this before. When Susan first raises the issue to the family, she reads from a prepared statement and stumbles over the words. At one point, Nathan stands up to help her with a word she can't pronounce.
One thing that's very clear, if you following the court's opinion and following this case, Nate was strictly out for money.
There was the expectation that as the son or daughter of Bill and Genevieve Gore, you had a responsibility to set aside those shares of stock. And perhaps that was the way that they were trying to instill some financial responsibility in their children, which perhaps would then be passed on to their grandchildren. Many parents, when they're sending a child off to college, if they're able to pay for college, will say to the child, here's your check for the semester. If you run out, don't come back. That's essentially what Bill and Genevieve Gore said to their children. Here are your shares of stock, but you're expected to pass down these many shares of stock to your children. Don't come back for more.
For 4 of the Gore children, this goal was achieved, but not for Susan.
Susan obviously felt that she had let down her children and was trying to find a way to make up for it.
The other Gore children had saved their money, they invested wisely, they were not extravagant. Susan, on the other hand, took a completely different vibe.
By the late 1990s, Susan, then in her late 50s, is on the brink of bankruptcy.
She had 3,900 shares of stock. It had to be worth well over $100 million. What happened to all that money?
After her divorce from Jan in 1981, Susan begins exploring a controversial movement called Transcendental meditation.
I believe after her marriage to Jan, she was distraught. She was looking for a place to belong. She definitely was not feeling that she belonged with the Gore family because she was so different. She had pursued a different path. Her relationship with the Gores was also a little strained because of her marriage. Her relationship with her parents was a little strained because of her marriage, and she was looking for a place to belong.
What happened to Susan Otto, the fact that she became so easily influenced and under the sway of TM, is not an uncommon story. When people are going through a painful period, when they're troubled, that point in their life, at that juncture, they are more vulnerable to be recruited by a totalistic or cult-like group. Because the group comes to you not as a destructive group, but as a benign, helpful group that will help you out of your depression, out of this difficult time in your life, with answers, with practices to give you peace of mind, joy, fulfillment.
And that is exactly what Transcendental meditation promises.
Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was the founder of the Transcendental meditation movement, which began in India and then became an international organization around the world. It began really in the 1960s, and it became popularized by the Beatles. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, George Harrison went to India and lived in a kind of intentional community that was centered around Maharishi Mahesh Yogi.
Made famous overnight by the Beatles' endorsement, the founder of TM, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, begins teaching Transcendental meditation around the globe.
He believed that this meditation could promote good health, could give you peace of mind, and as the years went by, their claims became even more fantastic, that it could bring peace to the world, that meditation done in groups could reduce the crime rate, could pacify areas of the world. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi claimed that he could teach people to fly. To the objective observer, it looked like people hopping in a lotus position on a mat.
Inner peace does not always come cheap.
People were giving money for courses, for meditation, hoping to make the world a better place.
Susan gives enormous sums of money to TM.
At that point, she still had a good amount of her money left. She had funded a program that was going to introduce the Transcendental meditation movement to inmates in federal correctional facilities in the United States.
She even moves across the country to Fairfield, Iowa, home of a university founded by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi.
She had gone to Iowa to this Maharishi University, and it broke her health, and it broke her fortune.
When Susan finally leaves the movement in 1995, she is not in good shape.
Transcendental meditation, which can be seen as transcenduction or self-hypnosis, can have debilitating effects. It puts you in a disassociated state. You become highly suggestible, and former members have said that this can be destructive.
It almost destroyed her, I think, physically and mentally. I don't know, it's supposed to help you out, but apparently it had the opposite effect on her health, and her mental and physical health, and her financial health as well.
By 1999, she was living in a monastery, basically convalescing, because she just couldn't take the strain anymore.
When she finally recovers, Susan has hardly any money left. And so, she turns to her mother.
She had to go back to Genevieve to ask for her shares from the trust to help get her back on her feet. And Genevieve was reluctant at first, but then she started to come around, and she did give Susan a good amount of money, clearly not as much as her brothers and sisters had, but certainly enough for her to live a comfortable, I'd say, middle-class lifestyle. The rest of the family was not happy about that. Susan's brothers and sisters very much looked down on her for being involved in the cult, and I think they looked at it as an example of her being easily manipulated. I think they also looked at it as she was, wasting money that her parents had worked very hard for to give her.
Some in court are stunned by the news of her involvement in TM.
The public found out about this through the court hearings. Well, that was the first real hint of that anything was unusual with the Gore family, or that there was a member of the Gore family who was not as conservative as the other members of the Gore family. This is another example of the Gores and why they wanted to go to mediation, and why they wanted to really keep this case out of the courts and out of the public, because they knew some of this damaging stuff about them would come out, and that was a really big concern for them.
And the judge is not impressed.
The financial impact it took on her, leaving her with less money for her children, that really played into the court's decision.
Things do not look good for Susan or her family. But a long-forgotten document will change everything.
Out of the blue, it came out that the Otto grandchildren had found that there was a trust that was devised several months before the Pokeberry Trust.
6 years after their mother, Vive Gore, is buried, the Gore family is in court. It's time for the judge to decide if Susan Gore's adoption of her ex-husband is valid, and whether it goes against Bill and Vive's true intent when they made the Pokeberry Trust. Intentions that Vive fought hard for when she was alive, as courtroom testimony reveals.
Well, Nathan had approached her several times about changing the will before her passing.
Nathan can't convince his grandmother. She refuses to change the trust and is very upset. Another Gore grandson and Nathan's cousin testifies that he visits her and asks why.
She looked at him and said, "The vultures are circling, waiting for me to die," because they had been asking her to change this trust without mentioning adoption. And so she was really wary of them, and she got angry and upset, and was very firm that she was not going to change this trust. But that's a pretty prescient statement. The vultures are circling. And they were.
But Nathan doesn't give up and approaches Vive again, this time at her 90th birthday party.
He cornered Genevieve at her birthday party and was forcefully trying to convince her to change the will so that he could get equal shares as his cousins. And that was very upsetting, and that was upsetting to a lot of people. And, to the point that Susan even had to tell him to calm down and sort of move him away, because she could see how upset and how distraught Genevieve was becoming.
I mean, she's 90 years old. She's lived her life. She's done well. She's seen all her grandchildren be fabulously rich. And I think she was fed up with them at this point.
The testimony that Nathan had confronted Genevieve at her birthday party and forcefully and pointedly tried to convince her to change the will, influenced the judge's decision, because that was another example of how the will, structured the way it is clearly the Gore's intent and clearly what the Gores wanted.
The judge also addresses the alleged unfairness in the trust in his decision about the validity of Jan Otto's adoption and whether the true Otto son should inherit more.
The judge ruled that the unfairness didn't lie with the Pokeberry Trust as set out by Bill and Genevieve Gore, because the Pokeberry Trust contributed what it was supposed to contribute in terms of inheritance. The unfairness, as the judge put it, lay in the fact that Susan had already spent her shares of stock and that she didn't contribute her end of the deal.
The court rejects the adoption and declares that Jan is not a grandchild in the eyes of the Pokeberry Trust. Nathan and his brothers will get nothing more. After a 6-year dispute, the Gore siblings are relieved to finally have the matter settled.
Considering that the judge ruled in favor of the intent of the trust, I would imagine that Bill Gore would have been pleased and displeased. Pleased that the intent of the trust was backed up by the judge's decision, and probably heartbroken by the steps that Susan took to try to take advantage of the way that the trust was structured.
But Susan thinks she has an ace up her sleeve. Another trust was found during the discovery phase of the trial, and that trust could change everything.
You know, out of the blue, it came out that they had found that there was a trust that was devised several months before the Pokeberry Trust, and it gave each grandchild an equal share. And it was submitted as the real intent of Bill and Vive Gore to show that, yes, the children, or the Gores, really wanted all the grandchildren to have an equal share.
It was drafted in May 1972, 5 months before the October Pokeberry Trust.
If not for discovery in this litigation, nobody would have ever found out about that original May 1972 will. That's kind of interesting that the Gores, that it was activated, but it was kept such a secret that nobody found out about till 30-some years later while going through his notes for discovery.
But that came out of left field, and I was like, oh, maybe there is, maybe there is something to this. As a reporter, I'm listening to it, oh, this throws a wrinkle into everything. The fact that there's two trusts was a little surprising, and even the judge said, was there any reason I shouldn't take this trust as seriously as the other one? But he ultimately ruled that the Pokeberry Trust, because it was done the way they had done all the other trusts in the same process, was the valid one.
Susan and her legal team disagree, and so they decide to seize one final chance to overturn the judge's decision, and she appeals to the Supreme Court.
They challenged the October Trust because based on the May Trust, which again nobody knew about, they would be entitled to more money.
There were several arguments that were made. The most important one, which is the one that the court focused on, was what were the intent of Bill and Vieve, as they called her, Genevieve Gore, when they executed or signed a May Trust agreement and followed by an October Trust agreement.
The attorneys for the other Gore family members contest the May Trust validity.
What did they really mean by creating this May instrument, saying it was irrevocable, then putting it in a drawer, never telling anyone about it, not going through the formalities of execution as they had done for 26 other trusts that they had created in their lifetime?
Could the Gores have forgotten about it? Or did they change their minds?
This CPA who worked for the Gore family for years testified that in the late 70s he was given a bunch of different trusts to help them prepare an estate plan for the family. And this other trust that came out in the trial was never part of that. And that he was always worked on the assumption that the Pokeberry Trust that Wilbert Gore had given him was the one that covered anything. And he, as to the other trust, he testified, I never heard of it before.
It was put in a drawer and never shown to anyone. None of the children, none of the grandchildren ever knew that it existed. It really wasn't, the May instrument really wasn't discovered until the litigation began, 40 years after it had been signed. So we concluded that the October Trust was really the only competent expression of the intent of Bill and Genevieve Gore.
The justices of the Supreme Court just ruled that there was no grounds for appeal, and it's a moot issue now.
According to the court decision, it was not Bill and Vive's intention to ensure all grandchildren had equal shares at all costs.
They couched it in terms of expectation, meaning we expect the children to do this. If they do not, for whatever reason, and they're free to do what they want with those shares, but if they do not, then it will have an adverse effect on their children. And that's what happened.
The dispute is finally settled, but the Gore family reputation has been altered forever.
When this case broke, it was a little bit before the financial crisis hit, but it wasn't resolved till after the financial crisis hit. And I think it was hard to get sympathy from a public that, when a lot of people are struggling financially, to see basically what amounted to millionaires squabbling over pennies. And I think that did leave a bad taste in the mouths of some people in Delaware.
Neither Bill nor Vive could ever have imagined what would come of their attempt to preserve Gore and Associates for the next generation.
Chemicals and molecules work by much more predictable rules than people, particularly family members.
Vive and Bill would be spinning in their graves over this.
Jan's greed cost him far more than a piece of the Gore's fortune. It has forever cost him his family.
At the trial, Jan sat by himself. No one talked to him the whole time. The only person he talked to was his attorney, and it was sort of pathetic watching him sort of, trying to get a piece of this fortune that he had walked out on years ago, and everybody basically ignoring him as if he wasn't even there.
While his sons, according to Justice Steele's decision, will inherit exactly what the Pokeberry Trust dictates, and not a cent more.
I do think most people would agree that the will is unfair, and I think most people would understand efforts to reasonably change the will and reasonably try to make the will structured a lot more favorably towards them and a lot more even among the grandchildren. But when those efforts were not successful, it seemed like they resorted to a lot of forceful and definitely through the adoption underhanded methods. And I think that's definitely the line that should not have been crossed.
Fair or not, that, according to the court, was what Bill and Vive intended when they created the trust.
Well, a lot of people say that the Gores could not imagine something like this happening, but their lawyer warned them, and their lawyer actually used that language. Things will happen that you can't imagine if you structure your trust this way. There will be divorces, there will be possibly stepchildren, there will be adoptions, there will be a lot of things that we can't conceive of now that may, in 1972, that may be commonplace by the time you pass and this will goes into effect. And he was still adamant that this will be structured in the way that it was.
What is the moral of the story? One would be that, when it comes to money, people will do almost anything to try to get what they think is rightfully theirs, or to create the idea that this is rightfully theirs. I don't think there's like a diminished view of the Gore family from people I've spoken with, but they do wonder, what was that lady thinking by adopting her ex-husband, really just such an unusual adoption. Certainly, if you mention the Gore name to people around Delaware now, the people that follow the story would just wonder, what happened with it? What happened in that branch of the family?
I think the public in Delaware looks at Gores as a lot more dysfunctional than they used to look at the Gores. I don't know that it's permanently damaged the Gores' reputation because it's really Susan who caused all this. I think Susan's reputation got severely damaged through this. But as for the rest of the Gore children, I'm not so sure that people in Delaware have a less favorable opinion of them now than they did before the trial started.
It's always interesting what wealth does to people, what it does to companies. Success really does plant the seeds of failure, and if you can find a way to avoid that in your company, then you've established a culture that is likely to lead to that company being successful for generations to come. It is much more difficult to do that with family. And we should not be too critical of the Gores. Overall, they're a family that is well respected, that has contributed to their communities, and that has certainly contributed an incredibly successful company that employs 10,000 people. And it's not the worst thing that's ever happened.
Bill and Vive's trust ensures that the company will survive for generations to come.
I believe it will be successful in the end. I believe that the company's been incredibly successful. The company's well run. It's grown significantly. I think even Gore would be surprised I think Bill Gore would be surprised today how huge that how huge Gortex has become.
Hikers are still wearing Gore-Tex. They're putting those backpacks on, and they have their special lining on their ski coats, and nothing's changed in that respect.